The hallway light was dim, just a small bulb casting long shadows along the narrow corridor. I stood frozen at the top of the basement stairs, the cold air brushing against my skin, sharp and unexpected in the quiet of the night. My hand reached out instinctively, fingers grazing the wooden railing. The wood was rough beneath my palm, cool and unyielding, grounding me in the moment as I strained to listen. There was a sound, soft, almost inaudible, but it was there. Something moving below the floorboards. For years, I had accepted the rules my husband set without question. The blue key he kept on a hook by the kitchen door, the basement door he always locked, the offhand warnings not to go down there. He said it was just clutter, old boxes and tools, nothing worth worrying about. I believed him. I thought he was just private, someone who needed his space. He spent hours in that basement, and I gave him that time without complaint. But tonight was different. The sound beneath the floor made my skin tighten. It wasn't the usual creak of the house settling or the wind outside. It was deliberate, something alive moving in the dark, beyond reach but close enough to hear. I stepped forward, my foot hovering over the first stair. My heart raced, a dull thud in my chest, and I reached for the door handle, cold metal against my fingers. Before I could turn the knob, he was there. Suddenly, in the dim light, standing between me and the basement door. His face was pale, slick with sweat despite the chill around us. His eyes were wide, filled with a panic that made my stomach drop. He was out of breath, trembling like I'd never seen before. "Don't," he said, voice low and urgent, blocking my path with his body. I looked at him, confused and afraid. It wasn't the basement he seemed to fear, it was me going down those stairs. His entire posture screamed that he was terrified of what I might find. That's when the weight of everything shifted. The locked door, the untouched key, the nights he vanished without explanation, they weren't about privacy. They were about hiding something I wasn't meant to see. Before we dive deeper, take a moment to settle in. What's coming next will change everything you thought you knew. Trust me, you won't want to miss a single detail as the story unfolds. It's not just about what's hidden behind that door anymore, it's about how our lives are intertwined with the secrets buried beneath this house. Stick around, because every revelation will pull you further into the mystery, and the truth is far more complex than it first appeared. Let's keep moving forward together and see where this takes us. At first, the smell was faint, barely noticeable unless I was standing just outside the basement door. It was a sharp metallic odor, like blood mixed with rusted iron. I remember pausing in the hallway more than once, sniffing the air and wondering if maybe it was just the old pipes or some forgotten leak. My husband brushed it off every time. He said it was nothing, probably just the furnace or the humidifier acting up in the damp basement. I accepted that because I wanted to believe him, and because I didn't want to make a fuss over something that might just be a harmless mechanical issue. Then there were the clothes. I found small piles of burned fabric in the trash on several occasions. Not a whole shirt or pants, but scraps, threads, buttons, pieces of sleeve or collar. I asked him once about that, and he said he'd been working in the garage, had to get rid of some old rags that were soaked with oil and grease. That made sense, I thought. He was always tinkering with his motorcycle or fixing things around the house. I figured burning oily rags was a common way to dispose of them safely, so I didn't press further. The tools started to disappear next. At first, it was just a screwdriver here, a wrench there. I noticed the toolbox looked lighter, but I thought maybe he'd taken some tools to work or had lent them to a friend. It wasn't unusual for him to borrow or lend tools. He was always helping neighbors with repairs or projects. But then, whole sets of pliers and even the power drill went missing. When I asked, he said he'd replaced some tools, or that he had moved things around in the garage and basement, so they might be somewhere else. I believed him because he was typically organized, and I assumed he would find them again. Late at night, I heard him moving around downstairs. Usually, I fell asleep quickly, but sometimes I'd wake up to the sound of shuffling, the creak of floorboards, and a distant thud or two. I never saw him leave the house, so I assumed he was just up late working on some project or checking on something. When I asked about his nighttime activity, he said he was adjusting the security system or fixing a leak. That seemed plausible enough. After all, the house was old, and things broke down regularly. The basement door itself was often locked. I had a key, but whenever I tried to open it, I found it bolted from the inside or the lock jammed. He always said it was for safety, that the basement had old wiring and could be dangerous if left open. I accepted that explanation. I didn't want to argue or pry into a place he considered off-limits, so I didn't insist. Looking back now, these things weren't random. The smell wasn't from the furnace or humidifier. The burned fabric wasn't just old rags. The missing tools weren't lent out or replaced. The locked basement door wasn't about safety but secrecy. And those late-night noises weren't about repairs. At the time, I pushed it all aside, telling myself it was just quirks and habits, normal enough in a man who liked working with his hands and valued privacy. I didn't want to see the signs, but now I know they were warnings, pieces of a puzzle I was too afraid or unwilling to put together. The smell hit me the moment I opened the basement door. It was sharp metallic, like iron mixed with something acrid, almost chemical. At the time, I told myself it was probably rust or some old paint peeling off the pipes. I'd stand there for a second, breathing it in and shrugging it off. My husband always worked down there, tinkering with his projects, and I figured the smell was just part of that. I didn't want to think deeper about it. For months, I noticed the locks on the basement door changed. Not just locked but reinforced. Sometimes I found the door latched from the inside, even though I was sure he was sleeping upstairs. When I asked about it, he said it was to keep the cats out or that he was trying to keep some tools safe from moisture. I accepted those explanations. I didn't want to press him, and honestly, the basement was his space. I told myself everyone deserves some privacy. The clothes were the first thing that really unsettled me, but I pushed the feeling away. I'd find scraps of fabric, sometimes burnt, sometimes singed around the edges. At first, I thought he was just burning old rags from his workshop. That made sense. He was always cleaning up the mess after a project. But sometimes the fabric looked like it came from clothes, not just old towels or shop cloths. One time I pulled out a piece of shirt sleeve from the trash, half charred, smelling faintly of smoke and something else I couldn't place. I asked him about it, and he laughed it off, saying he had a small fire in the workshop while soldering a pipe joint. I nodded and didn't ask more. Tools went missing too. Not the usual screwdrivers or hammers, but specific ones, precision tools he used for his woodworking and mechanical repairs. I noticed the toolbox wasn't as full as it used to be, but whenever I asked, he said he'd misplaced them or loaned them to a friend. I believed him, because that was easier than imagining something else. I even bought a couple of replacements, but they disappeared too, and I never saw them again. It was frustrating, but I figured he was just disorganized or careless. Late at night, I heard noises. It wasn't the usual creaks of an old house settling or the wind rattling the windows. These were deliberate sounds, soft thuds, the scrape of metal against concrete, the faint hum of a machine running somewhere below. I'd lie awake, trying to convince myself it was normal. Maybe he was working late on a project, repairing something noisy. When I asked him about it the next day, he said he was fixing the furnace or testing some equipment he was building. I accepted those answers because I wanted them to be true. Sometimes, I'd find the basement door locked during the day. I'd ask if I could come down and help or just check on things, but he'd always say it was better if I stayed upstairs. I didn't push. His insistence felt strange, but I told myself maybe he was just particular about his workspace. I didn't want to upset him or stir up unnecessary tension. Now, looking back, I realized those details weren't quirks or harmless habits. The smell wasn't just rust. The burnt clothes weren't random scraps. The missing tools weren't lost. The locked door wasn't about keeping cats out. The late-night noises weren't about repairs. At the time, I convinced myself everything was normal because it was easier than facing the truth. I ignored the signs because I didn't want to know what they meant. But they were warnings, and I was the only one who chose not to see them. The night he came home like that, shaking, dirt smeared all over his clothes, I remember every detail as if it were etched into my skin. The front door creaked open just a crack before he slipped inside, shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the floor. His shirt, once a crisp white, was now streaked with dark, clinging mud. His jeans looked scuffed and torn, bits of earth caked into the fabric like they'd been dragged through a garden grave. I could smell it before I saw it, dry soil mixed with something metallic, faint, and unsettling. He didn't say a word as he closed the door behind him. I stood frozen in the kitchen, watching him, heart thudding uncomfortably. His breathing was shallow and uneven, like he'd been running or holding something heavy inside his chest. Each breath came out in quick, ragged bursts, like he was trying to steady himself but failing. His hands trembled slightly, fingers twitching as if they couldn't find rest. I stepped closer, instinct pulling me toward him, but he flinched away when I reached out. His eyes didn't meet mine. Instead, he kept staring down at the floor, as if afraid to see what I might read there. The usual warmth and familiarity in his gaze was gone, replaced by something cold, distant, and raw. "What happened?" My voice barely rose above a whisper. I wasn't sure if I was asking him or myself. He didn't answer. Instead, he moved quickly past me, heading toward the basement door at the far end of the hallway. His footsteps were hurried, uneven, echoing hollowly in the quiet house. My mind spun with questions, but something in his stance told me to hold back, to let him do whatever it was he needed to do. Before I could stop him, he yanked the basement door open and disappeared inside. I heard the low creak of the wooden steps beneath his feet, then the faint thud of something heavy being dropped down below. The sound was dull but distinct, a solid final kind of noise that settled into the silence like a weight. He didn't stay. Within moments, he was back upstairs, slamming the basement door shut and locking it tight, the bolt sliding into place with a click that reverberated through my chest. His hands were still trembling, but now they clenched into fists at his sides. I wanted to reach out again, to ask him why and what, to demand some kind of explanation. But he brushed past me, heading straight for the back door, pausing only to throw a glance over his shoulder. It was quick, almost dismissive, but I caught the flicker of something raw buried deep in his eyes. Fear, maybe shame, or something darker I didn't understand yet. Then he was gone, disappearing into the night before I could say another word. I stood there, the kitchen lights humming softly, the house suddenly feeling too quiet, too empty. The smell of dirt and something else I couldn't place clung to the air, as if the night had brought something unwanted inside with him. For the first time, I felt a real sharp thread of fear coil in my stomach. It wasn't the usual unease I'd pushed aside for months. It was something new, something that tightened my throat and made my hands shake. I didn't know what he'd dragged home that night, or why he'd locked it away in the basement, but I knew deep down that nothing would ever be the same again. The bathroom door was closed, the faint sound of water running masking everything else. He was distracted, and I knew this was my only chance. I stepped toward the basement door, each movement deliberate, careful. My fingers brushed the doorknob, cold and metallic, its surface smooth but worn, like it had been handled countless times before. It wasn't the kind of handle you'd expect on a basement door, too polished, almost clinical. I pressed my palm against it, feeling the slight chill radiate through the metal, grounding me for a moment. I turned the knob slowly, expecting the door to give way easily, but it didn't. The first lock resisted firmly, the mechanism inside catching with a faint but solid click. I could hear the subtle scrape of metal, dry mechanical, each internal gear moving against the other with deliberate stiffness. It wasn't just locked, it was fortified. Designed to delay, to keep whatever was behind that door from coming out or me from going in. I tried again, twisting the knob with more force, but the lock held fast. I could feel the tension rising inside me, a pressure building behind my ribs. My heart pounded harder. The sound of my breath came sharp and uneven, and my fingers trembled slightly against the cold knob. This wasn't a casual lock. There had to be more than one. I pressed my ear to the door, straining to catch any sound from the other side, but all I heard was the water running, steady and oblivious. Then I noticed the second lock. It was a deadbolt, set higher than the first, and when I reached for it, my hand bumped against something else. A chain latch, heavy and thick, bolted firmly into the wood. My fingers closed around it, the metal rough and cold under my skin. I could tell this wasn't a lock someone slapped on in a rush. It was measured, precise, deliberately layered. Whoever had done it wanted to make absolutely certain no one would open that door. I worked the deadbolt, dragging the bolt back with a metallic scrape that echoed faintly in the quiet house. The sound made my stomach clench, as if the door itself was resisting my intrusion. The chain was next, its links heavy and unyielding. I pulled on it, but it wouldn't budge. The bolts holding it in place were too strong, sunk deep into the frame. I ran my nails over the metal, feeling the sharp edges, the cold hardness. There was no way past this without tools, or brute force. My pulse accelerated, and a cold sweat broke out on my forehead. I pulled back from the door, my breath catching. He wasn't just forbidding me from going down there. He had physically barricaded it, made it impossible for me to open without him noticing. It wasn't a simple boundary, it was a barrier meant to hold something inside, or keep me out forever. The thought made my chest tighten again. I glanced toward the bathroom, the water still running, oblivious to this small confrontation happening just a few feet away. I wanted to find out what he was hiding, but this door was a wall between me and the truth. The locks, the chain, the resistance, they weren't just about privacy. They were about control. And now more than ever, I realized I was locked out of whatever was behind that door. For now. The house had settled into its usual quiet, the kind of silence that feels alive, as if every shadow holds a secret. It was just past midnight, and I lay in bed, the sheets tangled around my legs, listening. The faint hum of the city outside was a low, distant murmur, almost comforting, but beneath it, there was something else. Something from below. At first, it was subtle, a soft, dragging noise, like fabric or something heavy being pulled slowly across a rough surface. It started near the basement door, which was at the end of the hallway, just beyond the kitchen. I could picture it, the old wooden door, its chipped paint catching the dim glow of the night light in the hallway. The sound was irregular, uneven, like someone grappling with the weight of whatever they were moving. Then came the footsteps. Not the quick, light steps of someone trying to be quiet, but slow, deliberate, almost hesitant. They weren't the steady, confident strides of a familiar person moving about the house, but something more measured, as if each step was weighed carefully. The soles seemed to scrape against the concrete stairs, gritty, uneven, and worn down by years of use. I could almost feel the rough texture beneath those steps. Between the dragging and the footsteps were occasional thuds. Dull, distant, heavy enough to startle me, but muffled by the ceiling and the floorboards separating the basement from the rest of the house. The thuds weren't random, they seemed to mark time, a slow rhythm that punctuated the silence. Like something being dropped or set down with care, or maybe the result of something falling accidentally, but never quite settling. Sometimes, between these noises, there was a softer sound, something brushing against the door. It wasn't a bang or a knock, but a faint, almost tender contact. Like a hand or an object repeatedly grazing the surface, testing its resistance. The scrape was subtle but persistent, as if whoever or whatever was down there was trying to communicate without words, or perhaps just trying to catch a glimpse of what lay beyond the door. I held my breath, not daring to move, afraid that any sound I made might provoke whatever was causing these noises. My heart hammered in my chest, loud enough to drown out the thudding. Was it someone? Something? I wanted to tell myself it was the house settling, the pipes contracting in the cool night air, or a loose floorboard shifting under its own weight. But the sounds felt too purposeful, too deliberate for that. My mind raced, circling back to him, my husband. Was he down there? Was he the one making those noises? The thought twisted inside me, sharp and cold. I didn't understand what I was hearing. It wasn't a familiar creak or the usual groan of an old house. It wasn't the soft shuffle of a restless pet. It was something else entirely, and the not knowing was the worst part. I swallowed hard, the lump in my throat growing. The basement door stood silent now, but the memory of the sounds lingered in the air, heavy and thick. I wondered if I was imagining it all, or if there really was something, or someone, down there, waiting in the shadows I couldn't see. The unease settled deep inside me, a quiet fear that whispered, what if the secret wasn't in the basement, but in the person who held the key? I slipped out of bed, the floor cold beneath my bare feet. The house was silent except for the faint creaks that always seemed louder at night. I moved toward the stairs, the faint noise from below still echoing in my mind. My heart pounded, not just because of the sound but because of the weight of everything I hadn't said, everything he hadn't told me. I reached the top step and hesitated, breath shallow, before stepping down. Before I could take another step, strong hands grabbed my wrists. His grip was tight, more than necessary, fingers digging into my skin. I gasped, startled by the sudden force. He yanked me back toward the hallway, his voice rough and breaking. Don't ever go down there, he said, voice shaking so much it made my skin crawl. His eyes were wide, darting between me and the basement door like he was fighting something inside himself. I had never seen him like this, so raw, so afraid. Why? I whispered, voice trembling. I heard something. He shook his head fast, almost violently, like trying to shake the fear away. You don't understand. You don't want to know. His eyes locked on mine, and for a moment, I saw something behind the fear, panic, desperation, maybe even guilt. His knuckles were white where he held me, the tension in his arms pulling me closer. The warmth of his skin contrasted with the chill running down my spine. "I'm telling you this for your own good," he said, voice barely above a whisper now. "If you go down there, you'll regret it." I stared at him, heart pounding louder than ever. This wasn't just about some noise in the basement anymore. This was about him, about something he was hiding so deeply he was afraid of what I might find out. The fear in his eyes wasn't for himself, it was for me, or maybe for what I might discover. I tried to pull my hands free, but his grip held firm. "Please," I said, voice cracking. "Tell me what's going on." He looked away, jaw clenched, breath uneven. Then he dropped my wrist slowly and stepped back, the fight draining out of him. His face was pale, eyes hollow. "It's better if you don't know," he said quietly, avoiding my gaze. I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his words settle over me like a heavy stone. That night, as I stood frozen in the hallway, I understood, whatever was down there, whatever secret he was guarding, it was serious. More serious than I had ever imagined. And for the first time, I realized that the real danger wasn't the basement, it was the man who was so terrified of what I might find. The knock came just as the first reluctant light of dawn seeped through the curtains. Sharp, insistent, echoing down the hallway. I wasn't expecting anyone. Not at this hour. My heart thudded unevenly as I crossed the living room, each step slower than the last, trying to steady the tremor in my hands before I reached the door. Outside, two men in plain clothes stood side by side, badges clipped to their belts. Their faces were calm, professional, no hint of the storm I already felt gathering inside me. "Good morning, ma'am," the taller one began, voice low but direct. "We're with the local police department. We'd like to ask you a few questions about your husband's movements last night." I blinked, confusion and sudden alarm twisting in my chest. "My husband?" I echoed, trying to keep my voice steady. "What about him?" The other officer stepped forward, pulling a small notebook from his pocket. "Our records show his car was seen at several locations between midnight and 4 a.m. His eyes met mine, waiting. First, the old warehouse on Harbor Street. Then the 24-hour gas station on Westbrook Avenue. Finally, near the park by Maple Drive. Each name hit me like a cold gust. The old warehouse, abandoned for years, the kind of place you only hear about in crime stories. The gas station, a stop he never usually made. And the park, where I'd walked alone too many evenings, unaware that the night had swallowed him whole. I swallowed hard, my mind racing to piece together these fragments. "Do you know why he was there?" the taller officer asked, voice softer now, as if sensing my growing unease. I hesitated, the memory of his pale face flashing in my mind. His hollow eyes, the whispered warning, "It's better if you don't know." How long had I ignored the signs? The late-night phone calls, the sudden silences, the vague excuses that never quite added up. In my denial, I had buried the truth deeper than I should have. "No," I finally admitted, voice barely above a whisper. "I don't." The officers exchanged a glance. "We're investigating a series of incidents connected to those locations," the shorter one said. "Your husband's presence there has raised questions. We need to understand what he was doing, and if he's involved in anything that could be dangerous." A surge of panic rose inside me, sharp and cold. The basement, the secret he guarded, it all felt suddenly intertwined with those places, with the shadows he dragged into our home without me noticing. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the words stuck, tangled in the growing knot of fear and betrayal. "Has anything happened to him?" I asked, voice trembling. The taller officer hesitated briefly before nodding. "We're still trying to locate him. That's why we're here, to see if you have any information that could help." I shook my head, the weight of everything crashing down. The warehouse, the gas station, the park, each was a piece of a puzzle I hadn't realized I was assembling. And now, faced with the truth, the picture was darker than I ever imagined. "Thank you for telling me," I said quietly, stepping back as reality settled around me like a suffocating fog. I realized then how long I had turned away, how many warnings I'd missed because I was afraid of what I might find. But now, there was no turning back. The silence in this house had been broken, and with it, the fragile trust one had once held. The officers nodded, their expressions unreadable. "If you remember anything, no matter how small, please call us." As they walked away, the door closing behind me with a dull thud, I stood frozen, the morning light no longer gentle but harsh, illuminating everything I had tried so hard to ignore. The heavy door groaned as the officers forced it open, the sharp scrape of metal against wood slicing through the thick air. I stood back, heart pounding, unable to tear my eyes away from the yawning darkness that spilled out from the basement. A cold draft seeped up the stairs, carrying with it a musty, unfamiliar scent, dust, damp earth, and something burnt, acrid and lingering. The beam of a flashlight cut through the gloom, revealing shapes that made my breath catch. Boxes, dozens of them, were stacked haphazardly against the walls, some crushed under the weight of others, their cardboard edges frayed and stained. I noticed labels, scrawled hastily in ink, names I recognized, dates that matched disappearances I'd heard whispered about on the news. The realization hit me like a tidal wave. These weren't just forgotten belongings. They were reminders of people who'd vanished, their lives now reduced to these silent containers. Near the far corner, a pile of burned clothes lay scattered across the floor. Charred fabric curled like dead leaves, blackened and brittle. I stepped closer, the sight twisting my stomach into knots. These were things someone had tried to erase, but the remnants refused to disappear completely. A frayed scarf caught my eye, familiar, delicate, and suddenly I was drowning in memories I wished I could forget. On a battered wooden table sat notebooks, their pages yellowed and edges singed. I reached out, trembling, and flipped one open. Dates were scribbled in hurried handwriting, notes jotted down with a frantic urgency. Sometimes a name, sometimes just a cryptic phrase, gone after midnight, never spoke again, left no trace. The words felt like punches to my chest, each line unraveling the world I thought I knew. How had I missed this? How could I have been so blind? Maps were pinned to the basement wall, marked with red circles and jagged lines connecting them. They looked like hunting grounds, or worse, a twisted game board. My fingers traced the routes, the places I had casually walked by, never suspecting the darkness lurking beneath. The house I'd called home was no longer a sanctuary, but a vault of secrets I wasn't sure I wanted to uncover. The officers moved with quiet efficiency, cataloging, photographing, but I was rooted in place, drowning in a haze of confusion and disbelief. Every object, every note, chipped away at the foundation of trust one had built. The people I loved, the memories I cherished, they all felt tainted now, shadows stretching longer across the rooms I had once filled with light. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but my voice caught in my throat. Betrayal wrapped itself around me like a suffocating shroud. How could this have been hidden beneath my feet? How could everything I believed in be a lie, stitched together with silence and secrets? The basement wasn't just a room, it was a testament to deception, a monument to the fractures beneath the surface. As the officers continued their work, I felt the ground shift beneath me, the world I had known melting into something unrecognizable. The door to the basement stood open now, a gateway to truths I wasn't sure I was ready to face, but there was no turning back. The light from above no longer offered comfort, it exposed the fractures, the betrayals, the pain I was only beginning to understand. I want you to pause for a moment and really let this settle. Stories like hers don't shout. They don't announce themselves with sirens or headlines. They live quietly, beneath the surface of everyday life, tucked away in places you'd never think to look. I've heard so many like this, people waking up to the invisible dangers that were always there, just beneath their feet, in the walls they called home. It's easy to feel alone when you realize the ground beneath you isn't as solid as you thought. But you're not alone. These stories, our stories, connect us in ways that go beyond fear or shock. They're about resilience, about the human spirit trying to make sense of what was hidden in plain sight. And that's why it's important to stay with us, to keep listening, to keep learning. If you're still here, if you're still watching, it means you understand the weight of these truths. It means you're willing to sit with discomfort to find clarity. So I'm asking you now, subscribe to Under the Same Roof. Be part of this community that refuses to turn away from the hard stories, the quiet dangers that shape us all. And don't just watch, comment below with "I'm still watching." Let us know you're here, that you're engaged, that you're holding space for these stories alongside us. Your voice matters. It's a reminder that these experiences aren't isolated, that they ripple out and touch more lives than we realize. We'll keep bringing you stories of people who lived side by side with danger without ever suspecting it. Because beneath every roof, there's a story that deserves to be heard, one that might change how you see your own world. So subscribe. Comment, "I'm still watching." Stay with us for what comes next. Because the truth, however hidden, has a way of finding its light. And together, we'll face it.